Everyone thinks the hard part is getting the money. They are wrong. Getting a windfall, an inheritance, a lottery win, a legal settlement, a sudden equity payout is actually the easy part. It requires nothing from you except luck, timing, or someone else's death. The money arrives. It sits in your account. For about 72 hours, everything feels like a movie. Then the real game begins, and almost nobody is prepared for it. Here is the brutal truth that financial advisors whisper among themselves but never say out loud to clients. The overwhelming majority of people who receive sudden large sums of money are statistically worse off 5 to 7 years later than they were before the money arrived. Not just back to zero, worse, more debt, more broken relationships, more psychological damage, more shame. The National Endowment for Financial Education estimated that roughly 70% of people who receive a financial windfall exhaust those funds within a few years. Studies on lottery winners show that a significant portion end up in bankruptcy. NFL players, who earn millions over a career, see 60% of them face serious financial difficulty within 5 years of retirement. The pattern repeats across demographics, income levels, and cultures. So the question is not, how do I get rich? You already have the money. The question, the real question, the one that almost nobody asks correctly, is how do I not destroy myself now that I have it? That is a completely different problem. It requires a completely different toolkit. And nobody handed you that toolkit along with the check. This is that toolkit. Picture a spacecraft sitting on a launch pad. You have probably heard of escape velocity. It is the minimum speed an object must reach to break free from a planet's gravitational pull without any additional propulsion. For Earth, that number is approximately 11 kilometers per second. Below that speed, no matter how hard the rocket burns, gravity wins. The spacecraft arcs upward, slows, and falls back down. Now here is what most people miss about that metaphor when applied to money. The problem is not getting off the ground. A sudden windfall does that for you. The problem is that the moment you stop accelerating, the moment you sit back and relax because you feel like you have made it, gravity takes over again. Financial gravity is not a metaphor. It is a mathematically real force with a name: entropy. The natural tendency of any system, left without continuous intelligent input of energy, is to move toward disorder. Money, left without intelligent management, does not stay neutral. It degrades. Inflation eats it quietly. Lifestyle inflation eats it loudly. Bad decisions made under emotional duress eat it catastrophically. The people who lose their windfalls do not lose them because they are stupid. They lose them because they do not understand the physics of their situation. They think they have escaped gravity. They have not. They have merely been launched. And without achieving true escape velocity, the kind that comes from understanding systems, compounding, and the structure of wealth, they are on a ballistic arc. They go up. They feel free. Then they come back down. Escape velocity in financial terms is not a number. It is not $2 million or $5 million or 10. It is the point at which your assets generate enough return to sustain your lifestyle and grow simultaneously, without requiring your labor. That is the actual threshold. And reaching it requires completely different behavior than most newly minted windfall recipients exhibit in year one. The tragedy is that most people spend year one celebrating an escape they have not yet completed. To understand why this happens so reliably, you have to understand what money scarcity does to a human brain before the windfall arrives, and what sudden abundance does to that same brain immediately after. There is a landmark study conducted by economists Sendil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir, documented in their work on scarcity. Their research demonstrated something that feels counterintuitive until you really sit with it. Financial scarcity reduces cognitive bandwidth measurably. The mental load of managing poverty, juggling due dates, calculating whether you can afford both food and transportation, the constant low-grade arithmetic of survival, consumes working memory the way a background application drains a phone battery. The researchers found that the cognitive equivalent of losing approximately 13 IQ points is experienced by people under conditions of financial stress. 13 points. That is the difference between average and borderline impaired on a standard scale. The same person, the same brain, the same genetics, but under financial pressure, operating as if they had sustained a minor traumatic brain injury. And it is not just IQ. Cortisol, the primary stress hormone, rises sharply under conditions of financial uncertainty. Chronically elevated cortisol impairs the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain responsible for long-term planning, impulse control, and the ability to assess risk accurately. What replaces it is the limbic system, older, faster, survival-oriented. The brain that governed our ancestors' responses to predators on the savannah is now governing decisions about a six-figure bank account. This is the neurological starting point of most windfall recipients. They arrive at their money not with a calm, well-rested, fully functional mind. They arrive depleted, stressed, carrying years of cortisol-soaked decision-making patterns, carrying the neural pathways of scarcity. And then the dopamine hits. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter of anticipation and reward. When the money arrives, the brain floods with it. The scarcity pathways, which have been dominant for years, do not simply switch off. Instead, the brain compensates. It seeks to neutralize years of deprivation signals through rapid reward acquisition. This is sometimes called the poverty hangover response, and it is almost universal among people who move suddenly from scarcity to abundance. The result is not irrational spending. From a neurological standpoint, it is perfectly rational. The brain is trying to heal. It is trying to recalibrate years of "you cannot have this" signals by rapidly accumulating evidence that the restriction is over. The new car, the vacation, the restaurant meals, the designer clothes, the generous gifts to family and friends. These are not character flaws. They are stress responses dressed in consumer clothing. But they are lethal to long-term wealth. The person who grew up financially comfortable, or who built wealth slowly over time, does not experience the same dopamine cascade when a large sum arrives. Their baseline is different. Their neural pathways around money are different. They are more likely to experience a large deposit as an abstraction, a number on a screen that belongs to a system they already understand. They are less likely to feel an urgent biological imperative to convert that abstraction into tangible things they can touch and taste and show to other people. This is the deepest, least discussed asymmetry between the wealthy and the suddenly wealthy. It is not about discipline. It is about neurology shaped by decades of very different environmental pressures. Understanding this does not make you immune to it, but it changes the game from fighting an enemy you cannot see to fighting one you can name. Before you can understand what to do with sudden money, you need to understand the structure of the system you have been living inside, and why that system was designed to be extraordinarily expensive for people at the bottom. There is a concept that the late Terry Pratchett articulated through a fictional character named Sam Vimes, a poor man who became a police captain. Vimes observed that cheap boots cost $38 but wore out in a season. Good boots cost $50 but lasted a decade. The poor man, forced to buy cheap boots because he could not afford $50 up front, spent more money on boots over 10 years than the rich man who bought once and forgot about it. The reason that the rich were so rich, Pratchett wrote, was because they managed to spend less money. This is not just a charming literary observation. It is a description of a structural tax on poverty that compounds across every category of spending. Let us run the actual numbers. A person without a credit score borrows money at 18 to 29% APR through a credit card or payday loan. A person with excellent credit borrows at 4 to 7% through a personal loan or line of credit. On a $10,000 emergency expense over 3 years, the difference in total repayment is approximately $6,000. That $6,000 is not going into any investment. It is gone. A person who rents rather than owns pays. On average, in most American cities, roughly 40 to 60% more per square foot per year than the equivalent cost of owning the same property with a fixed mortgage. They build zero equity. They have zero tax deduction. And in most cities, their rent will increase every 12 months while the homeowner's principal payment stays flat. A person without access to bulk buying, no warehouse membership, no storage space, no cash flow to buy ahead, pays retail for every consumable. They pay more per unit of toilet paper, more per ounce of protein, more per kilowatt hour of electricity on a prepaid plan. The premium on poverty and everyday consumables runs approximately 20 to 30% above what a financially stable person with planning capacity spends on the same goods. Car insurance. If you have had a lapse in coverage because you could not afford premiums, your next policy costs significantly more, even if you have no accidents on record. The insurance industry penalizes the inability to pay as if it were a predictor of moral failure. This effect compounds over years. Medical care. People without insurance or with high deductible plans avoid preventive care because of upfront cost. The result is that conditions that would cost hundreds to treat early cost tens of thousands to treat when they become emergencies. This is not a healthcare problem alone. It is a mathematical problem with a predictable outcome. Banking. Overdraft fees, minimum balance fees, check cashing fees at non-bank institutions. These represent a parallel financial system that extracts approximately $200 to $400 per year from people who cannot maintain minimum balances. It is a fee for being poor. It is paid on top of everything else. Add it all together, and the structural cost of being at the bottom of the income distribution, paying premium rates for borrowed money, insurance, goods, services, and credit access, runs somewhere between $3,000 and $8,000 per year, above what a financially stable person pays for the same baseline quality of life. That is the poverty premium. That is the entry-level tax. And it is paid not by bad decisions, but simply by not having enough capital to access the cheaper tier of the same economy. When your windfall arrives, one of its most powerful first uses is simply eliminating that tax. Not becoming rich, just escaping the expensive tier. Not luxury, just efficiency. The person who understands this immediately pays off high-interest debt, establishes an emergency fund large enough to avoid future high-cost borrowing, gets proper insurance coverage, and stabilizes their banking relationship. These actions alone, before any investment strategy, save more money per year than most people earn from their first investment portfolio. The math is unambiguous. But almost nobody does this first, because the brain does not want efficiency. The brain, coming out of scarcity mode, wants visible proof of freedom. It wants to feel rich. And feeling rich in the short term looks nothing like financial efficiency. That gap, between what the brain wants and what the mathematics requires, is where most windfalls are lost. So let us build the actual architecture of survival. The first and most critical phase, the one that nobody recommends because it is profoundly unsexy, is what might be called the monk period. When the money arrives, the single most dangerous thing you can do is make any significant financial decision in the first 30 days. Not because you are incapable, but because your brain is in a state of neurochemical upheaval that is genuinely incompatible with quality long-term decision-making. The dopamine flood is real. The grief, if the money came from a death, is real. The social pressure from people who suddenly want proximity to your resources is real. The fear of making a mistake is real. All of these forces operating simultaneously in a brain that has been running on cortisol for years creates a cognitive environment that is, quite simply, unreliable. The monk period means one thing: do nothing irreversible. Park the money in the most boring, insured, accessible place available. A high-yield savings account, a short-term treasury fund, anything federally insured, liquid, and not invested in anything whose value fluctuates. You will earn a small amount of interest. More importantly, you will not lose a large amount of money to a decision made while your brain is still processing the seismic shift that has just occurred. The monk period lasts 90 days at minimum. Some advisors say 6 months. The point is not arbitrary caution. The point is that you need to let your nervous system recalibrate. You need to let the dopamine systems quiet down enough for the prefrontal cortex, the long-term planning structure, to reassert itself. You are not being passive. You are letting the most important decision-making organ in your arsenal come back online before you trust it with 8 figures. During this period, you do 3 things only. You assess the actual number, not the gross amount in your account, the real number, after taxes, after fees, after any mandatory disbursements or legal obligations. Many people do not know their actual number until weeks after the money arrives, because the tax implications of windfalls are surprisingly complex and almost always larger than expected. An inheritance may or may not trigger estate taxes, depending on jurisdiction and amount. A lottery win is taxed as ordinary income. A legal settlement may be partially or fully taxable, depending on what it is compensating for. Get a CPA, a certified public accountant, not a financial advisor, not a family friend, an actual licensed accountant who specializes in sudden wealth, to tell you your real number. Then you make a list, not of things to buy, a list of your current obligations and their costs. Every debt, its balance, its interest rate, its monthly minimum, every recurring expense, every insurance policy, every subscription. A complete, honest accounting of your current financial footprint. This exercise, which takes maybe 4 hours and feels boring and slightly painful, is the foundational document for everything that follows. Then, you do the one genuinely important thing of the monk period. You tell as few people as possible. This is not about secrecy for its own sake. This is about understanding a social dynamic that has destroyed more windfalls than any investment mistake. The moment people around you know that you have significant money, the social structure of your relationships changes. Not because people are malicious, most are not, but because humans are fundamentally wired to perceive a resource surplus in their social group as a potential source of relief for their own resource deficits. This is evolutionary biology, not moral failure. Your cousin who never called suddenly has a business idea. Your old friend who borrowed money years ago and never repaid it suddenly gets in touch to reconnect. Your parents or siblings, if they are struggling financially, experience a form of almost involuntary entitlement. Your romantic partner, if the relationship has any underlying tension, suddenly has a context in which to express it. None of these people are necessarily bad, but the pressure they create, combined with your own guilt, loyalty, and desire to prove that the money has not changed you, is one of the most powerful forces working against your ability to protect the capital. Silence is not coldness. It is strategy. Once the monk period ends, once you have your real number, your complete financial picture, and a nervous system that is no longer in acute shock, the next phase is structural. It is about building what might be called a moat. In military architecture, a moat is the water feature that surrounds a castle and makes attack exponentially more, is no investment vehicle available to retail investors that reliably returns 22% annually without significant risk. Eliminating high-interest debt is the single best risk-adjusted financial move available to most windfall recipients. It is not glamorous. It does not generate a story you can tell at dinner. But the mathematics are unambiguous. After high-interest debt, the moat continues with proper insurance coverage. Not just health insurance, though, that is critical. We are talking about a complete insurance audit. Do you have disability insurance adequate to cover your expenses if you cannot work? Do you have proper property insurance if you now own or plan to own real estate? If your net worth has increased substantially, do you have an umbrella liability policy? A relatively inexpensive product that extends your coverage against lawsuits significantly beyond what standard policies provide. The wealthy are meticulous about insurance not because they are afraid, but because they understand that a single uninsured catastrophic event can eliminate years of compounding. The third element of the moat is an emergency fund. Not an investment. An emergency fund. Liquid cash, accessible within 24 to 48 hours, equal to 12 to 18 months of your total living expenses. Not 3 months. The number typically cited for people with stable employment. 12 to 18. Because you are now managing capital, and capital management sometimes involves periods where liquidity matters enormously. A real estate transaction falls through, an investment is temporarily down, and you need to hold without selling. An unexpected tax bill arrives. Having 18 months of living expenses in liquid form means you never have to make a financial decision under duress. And financial decisions made under duress are reliably worse than financial decisions made from a position of stability. The wealthy call this dry powder, the ability to wait, the ability to not be forced to act. It is one of the most underrated financial advantages that money provides, and most windfall recipients squander it by converting liquid assets into illiquid ones, primarily real estate and consumer goods, before establishing this buffer. Now comes the part that separates the people who build lasting wealth from those who maintain it temporarily. Skills. Specifically, the combination of multiple domains of understanding that creates genuine competitive advantage. Here is a reality that the financial services industry would prefer you not internalize. Most of the people who will approach you to manage your money are not optimized to make you richer. They are optimized to generate fees and commissions from your assets over time. The standard model of wealth management charges approximately 1% of assets under management per year. On a $2 million portfolio, that is $20,000 per year. Over 30 years, accounting for the foregone compounding on those fee payments, the total cost to the client is often well north of $500,000. This is not fraud. It is the disclosed price of outsourcing expertise you do not have. The solution is not to manage everything yourself immediately. You should not, especially not early on. The solution is to develop enough understanding of the key domains that you can ask the right questions, evaluate advice critically, and detect conflicts of interest. This requires building a skill set across 3 areas: basic financial accounting, understanding an income statement and balance sheet; basic investment theory, understanding index funds, asset allocation, and the role of diversification; and basic tax law, understanding how different types of income are taxed and what legal structures minimize that burden. None of these require professional credentials. They require approximately 100 hours of focused reading and study. That is it. 100 hours spread across 6 months, using books written by people who have spent careers in each domain. The return on that 100 hours, in terms of better decisions, lower fees, and avoided catastrophic mistakes, is incalculable. The wealthy do not know everything about finance, but they know enough to evaluate the people they hire and to understand the reports they receive. This is the combination that creates a moat at the intellectual level, not genius, not credentials. Just enough domain knowledge across complementary areas to no longer be a passive recipient of other people's financial advice. The person who understands investing, tax efficiency, and basic accounting simultaneously is dramatically better positioned than someone who understands any one of those deeply while remaining ignorant of the others. A great investment strategy that ignores taxes is an inferior strategy. A tax-efficient structure that holds the wrong assets is an inferior structure. The combination, even at a basic level, multiplies effectiveness in ways that depth in a single domain cannot match. The social dimension of this process is the one that most people underestimate most severely, and it deserves direct, unsparing attention. There is a dynamic known in behavioral economics as the crab bucket effect. Put a single crab in a bucket and it will climb out. Put many crabs in a bucket and when one attempts to climb, the others will instinctively pull it back down. No individual crab is acting with malice. The system produces the behavior without any conscious intent. Human social groups operate on a version of this principle. Sociologists call it leveling mechanisms, the informal social norms that penalize members of a group who visibly move above the group's established economic or social level. The penalties are not always direct. They are often expressed as mockery of ambition, as accusations of arrogance or of forgetting where you came from, as an increase in requests for money or favors that, when declined, are framed as abandonment. This dynamic is not unique to any ethnic or cultural group. It is found across socioeconomic backgrounds and geographies. It is a structural feature of close-knit communities operating under conditions of shared scarcity. And it is devastating to people trying to use a windfall to fundamentally change their economic trajectory. Because the windfall does not change your social group automatically. You still live in the same neighborhood. You still have the same family. You still have the same friends who knew you before. And those relationships, which are real and valuable, and in many cases genuinely loving, operate according to the old rules. You are still the person from the group. The money is seen, consciously or not, as a group resource that one member is hoarding. The answer to this is not to cut everyone off. That is both emotionally brutal and practically counterproductive, because your existing relationships also contain real social capital, real goodwill, real people who genuinely care about you. The answer is a careful, intentional expansion of your reference group. Execute it slowly and without drama. This does not require moving cities or cutting contact with family. It requires adding new inputs, reading the books that the people you want to become read, listening to the lectures, interviews, and long-form conversations that shape how high-functioning people think about capital, risk, and time. Attending events, financial education seminars, industry conferences, community investment groups, where you are in the room with people who are further along the path than you. The goal is not to replace your existing relationships. It is to diversify your social inputs so that the voices shaping your mental model of what is normal, what is possible, and what is wise are not exclusively drawn from a context defined by scarcity. Wealthy people are not smarter than you. They are not more disciplined by nature. In many cases, they are not more talented. But they have been marinated, since childhood in many cases, in a set of assumptions about money, risk, time, and possibility that are simply different from the assumptions held by people who grew up without financial stability. Those assumptions can be acquired. Slowly, imperfectly, through deliberate exposure to better inputs. But they cannot be acquired if you are spending all of your social hours in environments that actively reinforce the old ones. This is not elitism. This is the same principle that governs any skill acquisition. You improve at tennis by playing with people who are better than you. You improve at financial decision-making by exposing your thinking to people who are further along in that dimension. Loyalty to your origins does not require that you remain permanently limited by them. At some point, and the timing depends entirely on the completion of everything described above, you begin to actually deploy capital. Let us be precise about what deploying capital means and does not mean. It does not mean picking individual stocks. It does not mean cryptocurrency, unless you deeply understand the asset class and are prepared to treat any allocation as potentially zero. It does not mean real estate development, angel investing, or any other complex asset class in the first 2 to 3 years. It does not mean funding your cousin's restaurant, your friend's app, or your neighbor's trucking company. These are not categorically bad ideas. Some of them may become appropriate eventually. They are inappropriate now because you have not yet developed the domain knowledge to evaluate them, and because the social pressure that usually brings them to you. The crab bucket dynamic, the guilt of new wealth, the desire to demonstrate that the money has not changed you, is not a reliable filter for investment quality. What deploying capital means in the early years is establishing a simple, low-cost, diversified portfolio structured to take maximum advantage of the one force in finance that is genuinely, reliably, mathematically on your side: compounding. Compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world. This statement is attributed to Einstein, possibly apocryphally, but the mathematics behind it are real regardless of who said it. Here is the actual number. If you invest $500,000 in a diversified equity index fund, averaging 8% annual return and do nothing else, no additions, no withdrawals, no clever strategies, after 30 years you have approximately $5 million. After 40 years, approximately $10 million. You did nothing except not destroy it. The wealthy do not get wealthy through superior stock picking. Study after study shows that the vast majority of actively managed funds underperform their benchmark index over any 10-year period. The wealthy get wealthy and stay wealthy through 3 things: avoiding catastrophic loss, maintaining diversification, and giving compounding enough time to work. Avoiding catastrophic loss means no single investment should represent more than 10% of your total investable assets. Preferably less. This is not timidity. This is the mathematical reality that a 50% loss requires a 100% gain just to break even. The asymmetry of loss is the most important and least intuitive fact in all of personal finance. Protecting against catastrophic loss is worth more than any upside opportunity. Maintaining diversification means spreading across asset classes, geographies, and time horizons in proportions appropriate to your age, liquidity needs, and risk tolerance. For most windfall recipients who have lived primarily in a scarcity context, the appropriate risk tolerance is lower than they think in the early years, not because lower risk is inherently better, but because the psychological volatility of watching a portfolio drop 30% in a market correction, before you have developed the experience base to contextualize it as normal, can trigger exactly the kind of panic selling that locks in losses permanently. Giving compounding time to work means understanding that the primary variable in wealth accumulation is not return rate. It is time. The difference between a 6% and 8% annual return sounds modest. Over 40 years on $1 million, it is the difference between 10 million and 20 million. Time is the input that most people do not have before a windfall because they were too busy surviving. Now that you have capital, you have purchased time. Do not squander it by being impatient. The specific vehicles, index funds, ETFs, target date funds, treasury bonds, are secondary to the principles. What matters is cost, diversification, and tax efficiency. Expense ratios on investment products should be below 0.5% annually. Many index funds charge as little as 3 basis points. Tax-advantaged accounts, Roth IRAs, 401ks, health savings accounts, should be maxed before any taxable investment account is funded, because the tax savings compound just as relentlessly as the returns do. A fee-only fiduciary financial planner, one who is legally required to act in your interest rather than earn commissions from product sales, and who charges by the hour rather than a percentage of assets, is worth engaging for a few sessions during this phase, not to manage your money ongoing, but to validate your strategy, identify tax inefficiencies you may have missed, and provide a second opinion on any decisions that feel uncertain. $100 an hour for 3 hours of expert review is infinitely cheaper than an annual management fee on a multi-million-dollar portfolio. There is a moment in this process, usually somewhere in the second or third year, when the transformation becomes visible, not to others necessarily, to you. It is the moment when you stop thinking about the money as a lump sum that could be spent and start thinking about it as a machine that produces income. The shift from "I have X dollars" to "I have a system that generates Y dollars per month" is the psychological equivalent of the spacecraft reaching escape velocity. It is the moment when the gravitational pull of your old financial identity, the person who did not have this, starts to genuinely weaken. The person who grew up without money thinks about capital as a stockpile, a finite amount that gets depleted with use. The person who has internalized the wealth mindset thinks about capital as a generator, something that, properly structured, produces more of itself continuously. These are not just different mental models. They produce different behaviors in every single financial situation. When a wealthy person sees a business opportunity, the first question is, what is the return on this capital and how does it fit my portfolio? When a person operating from a scarcity framework sees the same opportunity, the first question is often, can I afford not to try this? A formulation that prioritizes fear of missing out over rational allocation. When a wealthy person receives an unexpected expense, a car repair, a medical bill, a home maintenance issue, they draw from the emergency fund without stress, replenish it systematically, and file a mental note about the cost. When a person without that buffer faces the same expense, it triggers the full cortisol cascade: the cognitive impairment, the short-term borrowing at high rates, the disruption to every other financial plan. The same external event produces radically different outcomes based entirely on the presence or absence of the structural buffer. This is what the windfall is actually for. not the car, not the vacation, not the relief of people around you. It is the opportunity to install the structure that changes how every future financial event affects you. Most of the things people buy with windfalls are consumables. They are used, appreciated for a time, and become worth less than their purchase price immediately. A new car depreciates roughly 20% in the first year. A vacation has zero residual value the moment it ends. Designer goods retain a fraction of retail price. These purchases are not inherently wrong. Joy and pleasure and relief from deprivation are legitimate human needs. But they do not change the underlying structure. They do not make the next financial crisis easier to absorb. They do not compound. The structure changes the structure. The moat changes the foundation. The emergency fund, the paid-off debt, the diversified portfolio, the acquired domain knowledge. These are the things that, 3 years from now, mean that you are genuinely, durably, structurally different from the person who existed before the money arrived. That is the actual transformation on offer. Not the feeling of being rich, the reality of being financially resilient. Let us close with the hardest truth of all, and then with something that might actually be useful to hear. The hardest truth is this: the cage was never locked. Everything described in this document, the cognitive impairment from scarcity, the structural penalties on poverty, the social gravitational field of your origin environment, the neurochemistry that drives consumptive behavior after deprivation, all of these forces are real. They are not excuses. They are physics. But they are not permanent. They are not genetic destiny. They are environmental conditions that can be altered with the right inputs applied with enough consistency over enough time. The windfall is not the transformation. The windfall is the opportunity to begin the transformation. It is the extra fuel load that makes reaching escape velocity possible. But the trajectory, the angle of the rocket, the burn duration, the navigation, those are still yours to determine. Most people given this opportunity will not take it. Not because they are lazy or foolish, but because the social gravity is real and heavy and warm and familiar, and the path to escape requires doing things that feel wrong to the version of yourself that formed under conditions of scarcity. It requires saying no to people you love. It requires patience when every cell in your body wants to feel the relief of spending. It requires sitting with the discomfort of being temporarily misaligned with your social environment while you build something that does not yet exist. That is not a financial challenge. That is a psychological and moral challenge of the highest order. But here is what is also true. You now have something that most people never get: a window. A moment when the usual constraints have been temporarily suspended. When the mathematics of your situation can, if you act intelligently, permanently change the structure of your life and the lives of the people who come after you. Not the car you buy, the education fund you establish, not the vacation you take, the dividend income that eventually replaces your salary, not the relief you provide to everyone who asks right now, the stable, financially secure version of yourself, 3 years from now, who can give from a position of abundance rather than sacrifice. The cage door is open. It has always been harder to walk through it than to stay. The comfort of the familiar, even when the familiar is constrained, exerts a force that pure logic cannot always overcome. But you know the physics now. You know the biology. You know the structure of the trap and the structure of the escape. What you do with that knowledge is yours entirely. Do not waste the window.